Hey everyone, welcome to our next lecture in the beginning of our final unit for the semester. I cannot believe we are here. Today we're going to be talking about critical race theory, what that means, and how we can apply it to literature. I know I normally have my camera on during these lectures, but for some reason my internet is kind of acting up today, and when I have my camera on, it kind of slows things down. So for now, I'm going to keep my camera off. I know you're going to miss seeing me, but hopefully you'll make it through. Hopefully you'll survive. Before I jump into the actual content, I just want to say that I know that, especially in the world that we live in today, there is kind of a stigma surrounding critical race theory. But I also think there is a strong misunderstanding of what critical race theory actually is. People feel very strongly about critical race theory on both ends of the spectrum. They love it or they hate it. There are, of course, people in the middle, but we don't really hear about those people, right? We always hear about the loudest people are always on the extreme ends, right? But just like all of our other lectures this semester, this is by no means going to be a comprehensive lesson on what critical race theory is. What you're about to learn is really just the basics. It doesn't even scratch the surface, honestly. There's a lot more going on to critical race theory, but I am just going to give you the basics, enough information for you to understand what critical race theory is and how we can apply it to literature to get a better look or a better understanding of how literature deals with race. So what is critical race theory? Critical race theory examines issues that stem from racial inequality. One of the things that it does is it highlights power dynamics between the oppressed and the oppressor, specifically with race, obviously. This is something similar to what we explored with feminist theory, right? We were interested in the power dynamics between genders. This is the same thing, except we are, of course, talking about race this time. Critical race theory also emphasizes how culture, race, and ethnicity shape identity and motivations. So these three categories, right? Culture, race, and ethnicity, those are kind of like hot topics right now, right? And critical race theory helps us kind of explore the ways that these things make us who we are, right? These are very important parts of many people's lives, even if we don't really consciously recognize that. These three things, they definitely, absolutely shape who we are, and they are often big motivators for the things that we do and the things that we pursue. So critical race theory kind of gives us some vocabulary to explore that. So like all the other theories that we have talked about this semester, critical race theory exists outside of literature, right? The theory itself is applied to many different disciplines. But because this is a literature class, we are, of course, interested in how we can use it with literature. So we use it essentially to examine how literature represents race and ethnicity and the social and cultural implications of these representations. So we're looking at how race and ethnicity is essentially illustrated in the literature, and what does that imply? The way that race and ethnicity is portrayed, what does that imply about society and culture at large? When we're reading literature, I think it's often easy to forget the big picture. Reading isn't just about reading, right? I mean, reading for pleasure can be, but we in this critical thinking class, we are more so looking at the big picture, right? How do these texts that we've been reading give us a broader picture of society at large? How does it help us understand the world better? And so with critical race theory, the idea is when we apply it to literature, it helps us understand what the implications of representations of race and ethnicity are in the real world, in society at large. Critical race theory helps us explore how culture, race, and ethnicity shape characters' identities. So kind of similar to psychoanalytic theory, we were looking at how do these different psychoanalytic terms make Holden who he is, right? Now we're moving away, of course, from looking at the mind, and now we're looking at how culture, race, and ethnicity shapes a character's identity. How does race affect this character? How did it build this person's personality or motivations, right? Culture, race, and ethnicity are extremely powerful concepts that shape a lot. It affects a lot. Again, even if we're not necessarily like actively aware of it, these things are definitely very powerful and can affect someone's identity. And so that's what we're looking at for the characters in our stories we're going to read. We are also going to be analyzing stereotypes, analyzing themes of racial inequality, and looking at how historical events affected the creating of and the characters in the text. We will break these down a little bit as we continue, but just overall, this is kind of a big picture of what we're looking at for critical race theory when we apply it to literature. So for critical race theory, knowing some history is definitely important to understanding the theory overall, or allowing the theory to help you understand literature, right? So understanding race theory requires some historical knowledge. The social, the political, and the economic conditions that a story was written in, like when the author wrote it, and the time that the story takes place in influences the text, right? So let's say like a story you're reading was written in October of 2020. The history of October 2020 is going to be very different than a book that somebody wrote in October 1912, right? We just live in a completely different time, and the history impacts both the story and how we approach and understand the story, okay? And that's both when the story was written, like when the author was creating it, and when the actual plot of the story takes place, okay? Knowing the author's background is really important. For this, we want to know what was going on in the author's life that pushed them to creating or moved them to creating or writing this piece that we are currently reading. What experiences with race did they have? What kind of culture did they celebrate? All of these things are very important, right? Because when we have an understanding of the author, it can often give us an insight that we otherwise may not have noticed in the story itself. Historical reception. How was this book received, or how was this text received when it was first published? And what does race have to do with that, right? Think about a book that was published in like 1866, so the year after slavery was abolished. Okay, slavery was abolished in 1865. And let's say the story is about an enslaved woman wanting to learn how to read. A person in 1866 is probably going to receive that very differently than we would receive it today, right? So we want to know, how was this story received when it was first published, and what did race have to do? How did race, culture, and ethnicity affect this historical reception? We also want to know about the types of resistance and activism that was going on when the book was written, and of course, the time period that the story takes place in, right? If a story takes place during the civil rights movement, that's probably pretty significant to the overall story at large. If the story was written, if the author wrote the story during the civil rights movement, that also probably had an impact on the story, especially if the story has to do about race, right? So knowing all of these things when we're using critical race theory is super important. That being said, it does take some research, right? And I know we hear research and we're like, oh man, I don't want to do the extra work. I understand. I was a student. I get it. But again, with this theory, history and race are just so inextricably connected that we can't really explore one without the other. We have to go that extra mile to understand the historical knowledge. And I'm not expecting you to be a historian all of a sudden, right? Like, you don't need to know every single aspect of history that was going on during this time period, right? But you definitely should know the basics, so that way you can understand how history and all of these different aspects affected the story, okay? So whenever we're reading a story, whenever you start one of your new short stories, before you start it, you should at least look up the author, look up when the story was published, and what was going on in history, right, when the story was published. Then you'll start reading the story, figure out when the story takes place, like what time period the story takes place in, and do a little bit of research then, right? Of course, if it's the same time period in the story as it is when the story was written, you won't have to necessarily do any extra research. But let's say the story was written in 1950, but the actual story takes place in 1872. You'll have to do a little bit of research on both of those years, right, to get a clear understanding of the history of when the story was written and when the story takes place. Okay, so I keep throwing around these terms, culture, race, and ethnicity. I think it's safe to say that we probably have an understanding about how culture is different than these other two terms, but race and ethnicity are very often incorrectly used interchangeably. The definitions are similar, but they are absolutely different, and for this unit, it's important that we understand the difference. So race is a social construct, and we'll dive deeper in a little bit into what that means, but it's a social construct that categorizes people based on perceived physical traits, such as skin color and hair texture and other physical traits. So based off of perceived physical traits, okay? Race is very often hierarchical, right? Unfortunately. There is this kind of unspoken, but unfortunately spoken in many ways nowadays, and not just nowadays, but for a long time, that there's this like hierarchy of which races are better. Of course, we are trying to move away from that, but realistically, that still exists and has existed for a very long time. Race is how you are perceived by others, okay? This is super important. How you are perceived by others. You can be black, white, Asian, Native American, a bunch of different things, right? But race is how you are perceived by others based off of your physical or perceived physical traits, okay? Ethnicity is different. Ethnicity is about cultural expression. It's how you identify, that's supposed to say identify, how you identify or what your identity is within a specific group. And specifically, geographic location. So it has to do like with where you are, okay? So different than race, it doesn't necessarily have to do with perceived physical traits. There isn't any kind of hierarchy involved with this, and it's not about how you're perceived by others, but how you identify within a group that's associated with a geographic location. So race and ethnicity can be different, but they don't always have to be. So an example of when they would be different is an Asian man raised in Italy would racially be Asian because that's how he's perceived, their physical traits, but ethnically would be perceived as Italian, because they celebrate like Italian culture. They identify with Italians, right? Like their life very much so lines up with like the way of life of Italians. A way that it would be the same is if like an African man was raised in Africa, then they would be racially African, but also ethnically African, or racially black, ethnically African. Okay, so sometimes they line up, but they don't always have to. So as a recap, Race is a social construct that is essentially based on how other people perceive you based on your physical traits. There is a hierarchy. Some people think that one race is better than another, whereas ethnicity is more so about how you see yourself, the way that you express culture, the way you identify within a group, specifically associated with a specific place. Okay, moving on to two different terms. We have racialism and racism. They sound very similar. Their definitions are very similar, but they are different, and it is crucial, not only in this unit, but really outside of the classroom. It's crucial to understand what the difference is. So racialism is believing one race is superior or inferior to another. That sounds like racism, yes, but there is one key difference between these two terms. So racialism is believing one race is superior or inferior to another. Racism is also this, but the key difference is that the person who feels that they are racially superior to another race, that person has to be in a position of power or part of the politically dominant group of their society. I'll say that again. So racism is when someone in a position of power or someone who is part of the politically dominant group in their society believes one race is inferior to their own. Okay? I think we are all aware of what this racial hierarchy looks like in America, right? And I think it's fair to say that we know that the people who are at the top of that hierarchy are white people. White people in this country hold the position of power. The white race is the politically dominant group. And I know it sounds weird saying that, but this is kind of this is a unit where we have to be honest, right? We have to be blunt. And what I'm saying, I'm not saying this as in I believe this. So please don't think that I am saying that I personally think that the white race is better than the black race. That is so far from what I'm saying, but I kind of have to say these blunt phrases that I am uncomfortable saying, and so I can imagine you're uncomfortable hearing me say it, but I have to say these things to make sure you understand the difference in these terms, right? One thing that is commonly thrown around is this idea of reverse racism. And so that's when somebody black is racist towards a white person, right? People call that reverse racism. But according to the actual definition of racism, that's not possible. There is no reverse racism. That is racialism, absolutely, and it is still very wrong, but it is different than racism because a person who falls under any other racial group that is not white, any other group that is not in political power in this country, they can't be racist because they're not in power. To be racist, you have to have the position of power and see another race that in the hierarchy that exists is deemed inferior, okay? Anyone can be a racialist. Anyone can believe that one race is superior or inferior to another, but only those in the dominant group can be racist. Okay, so there are three different types of racism. We have institutionalized racism, internalized racism, and intraracial racism. That one's kind of a tongue twister a little bit. I had to work hard to say that. So the first one, institutionalized racism, is the incorporation of racist policies and practices in the institutions by which society operates. So this is not about a single individual. This is not an individual problem. This is a systemic issue, right? This is racist policies, racist ideologies being practiced or implemented into the corporations and institutes that our society functions under. So the judicial system, the fiscal system, the education system, right? the racist policies and practices in all of these different institutions that society operates, okay? So the court systems and law enforcement, okay? So, for example, people of color are significantly more likely to be arrested or pulled over than somebody who is white. People who are incarcerated, like the percentage of people of color that are incarcerated is significantly larger than the percentage of white people who are incarcerated, right? So and that's not because Black people are more likely to be criminals, that's what a lot of people think. That's kind of one of the big arguments, in politics at least. But that's not the case. It's because there are these different policies and practices that are racist, that are still in place, that have been in place in our government, in our country, since the very beginning, and they are still here. They still exist. Our country was built on so many of these foundations that unfortunately are racist, that still exist and are still affecting people of color in this country today. The second one is internalized racism. So now we're moving a little bit away from systemic to more of like an individualized racism. So internalized racism is the psychological indoctrination of racist doctrines to make people of color believe racist ideologies. So think back to our feminist unit. We had Lois Tyson's definition of a patriarchal woman, a woman who believes that she is inferior to men because that's what society has led her to believe, right? She has internalized all of these different ideas, right? This is the same thing, but instead of gender, we're talking about race now, okay? So for example, Black women chemically straightening their hair. Because white people are seen as like the standard, right? The default, the normal, the position of power, the politically dominant group, most white people have straight hair. And so Black women, it is so common that Black women straighten their hair because they think straight hair is better than curly hair, right? That's an example of internalized racism, that a trait of white people is better than a trait of a person of color. Black women chemically straightening their hair. And I can personally relate to this. I mean, as you know, I have very curly hair. And I didn't embrace that until like my mid-20s. Up until then, I straightened my hair every single morning. I got up, in high school, elementary school, junior high. I'd get up at like 5 o'clock in the morning, spend 2 hours straightening my hair because I wanted to look like everyone else. I didn't want to look different because I was mixed, because I was biracial. I thought that in order to be beautiful, I had to have straight hair like all the other girls. I would see, girls walking down the street and their hair blowing in the wind. And my hair didn't blow in the wind. My curly hair was super dense. And so, it doesn't blow in the wind that much. And that devastated me. And I just felt like something is wrong with me. Like I am less beautiful. I'm just less than. It made me feel inferior that my hair was different. And that's internalized racism. Thank goodness I found my way out of that. And now I love my curly hair. I completely embrace it. That is part of my heritage. That's part of my culture. It's part of my bloodline. Something that I'm very proud of. But it took a lot to get out of that because society, ingrains that. Think about all of the models that you see. It's getting better, but the majority of models that you see are white women with straight hair. There are, the majority of models are like that. Like they heavily outweigh models of color or models with curly hair. So last but not least, we have intraracial racism. This is racism within a single race. So if you remember back to a couple slides ago when we defined race and ethnicity, I gave like a list of different races, so like Black, white, Asian, Native American, things like that. So German people and Jewish people both are white racially. They both fall under the white race. And so, racism is believing one race is superior or inferior than another. But what happens when, within a single race, there's still that discrimination, thinking one is better than another, right? So Germans hating Jewish people, think back to World War II, that is very much so intraracialism. Germans thinking that they are better than Jewish people. Intraracial racism. Colorism in the Black community. If you've never heard that term before, colorism is essentially this idea that the darker the skin tone, the more inferior you are, right? Within the Black community, most people want lighter skin. Within the Black community, you are seen as better if you have lighter skin. Whereas if you have darker skin, you are less privileged. Okay, that's called colorism, another example of intraracial racism. So back when we were talking about the difference between race and ethnicity, one of the things that I said was that race is a construct. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. Social constructionism. So essentially, race is a social invention used to categorize and oppress people. So social invention, meaning this is something that somebody at some point created, right? It didn't just exist naturally. Somebody created it in order to put people in certain categories to create that racial hierarchy that we talked about, right? To give some privilege and to oppress others. There is no inherent biological differences that race is based off of. This is just a social perception and classification. So race has nothing to do with biology, but rather just this social invention that is used to put people in certain categories. Not only is there no inherent biological differences, there's actually a lack of a genetic basis. It says that humans are 99.99% identical at the DNA level. And that's across all races, that no matter what race you are, we are all 99.99% identical at the DNA level. And actually, there are often more genetic commonalities between people in different racial groups. So two white people that are compared to each other, they're probably more genetically different than maybe a white person and an Asian person. So again, with race, it is a social construct. Somebody created it. It is an invention to categorize people, put people into their own little boxes, to give some privilege and to oppress others. All right, moving on to discrimination. I'm sure most of us have probably heard this term before, but let's go ahead and break it down a little bit. So discrimination is any distinction, exclusion, or restriction on someone based on race or ethnicity. So any distinction, exclusion, or restriction based on race or ethnicity. So this happens both at an individual level, with an individual person, and also that systemic level, right? That bigger picture of society that we talked about earlier. So for example, an individual example of discrimination is if an employer doesn't hire someone because of their race, right? That is one single person discriminating against another person because of their race. Whereas an example of systemic discrimination is racial profiling by law enforcement. If you do not know what racial profiling means, it's essentially this discriminatory practice done by law enforcement or any other individuals in a position of authority, where they target individuals for suspicion of crime or any other kind of negative treatment based off of race or ethnicity. Okay, so not necessarily targeting people for suspicious behavior or evidence, but rather seeing someone of a certain race and deeming them or being more suspicious of them simply based off of that. So again, discrimination happens at an individual level, but also in these big, broader, larger systems at hand. Discrimination has a lot of different effects. It increases stress, it increases anxiety and depression among those who experience it. I mean, Imagine being like somebody distinguishing you in a negative way based off of your race. Imagine being excluded because of your race, or being restricted on something because of race or ethnicity. I mean, increasing stress, anxiety, and depression really negatively affecting mental health. That makes sense, right? Like those things would not feel good, right? And people of color, for most people, this is not just like a one-time thing where you experience discrimination once in your life and it never happens. People of color experience this on a daily basis sometimes, so it definitely has a lot of negative effects on mental health. Outside of mental health, there are other effects. Discrimination limits access to job opportunities. It limits access to quality education, to healthcare and housing, which of course, all of these things, if you are prevented from having access to them, leads to broader social and health disparities. And by disparities, meaning there's unequal distribution, right? One race has access to all of these things where there's a gap in between one race and another, right? That one race may not, simply because of their race or ethnicity. Discrimination also increases chances of receiving lower wages, causing higher rates of poverty among marginalized racial groups. So there's that phrase, the glass ceiling, right, when it comes to this discussion of who receives what kind of pay. And normally the conversation about discrepancies in pay, the conversation is normally around what women get paid and what men get paid. It's normally like a topic around gender. But race and ethnicity has a large part in this conversation too. Races outside of the white racial groups, they receive sometimes significantly lower wages, which can of course cause higher rates of poverty among those marginalized groups. If you look at different like poverty lines, right, or if you study certain areas that are extremely impoverished, more often than not, the population is not necessarily majority white. These communities are more often than not comprised of, majority non-white racial groups. And that's not because that they don't work as hard or they're just choosing jobs that, pay less. No, it's because of all of these restrictions that are placed on them. Limited access to job opportunities, limited access to quality education. And those two things go hand in hand, right? If you aren't able to get a certain type of education, then you're also not going to be able to have access to certain type of jobs, right? So these things really, they work together against certain racial groups, right? So discrimination is very powerful and it affects many, many, many people on a daily basis. So it's important for us as students, as the next generation, right, to understand these effects. So that way, when we see it happen, we can really understand and see the overall broader picture of how discrimination affects people. So moving on to white privilege. This is an unearned societal advantage or advantages that benefit white people over people of color in various aspects of life. White privilege is it often goes unnoticed by those who benefit from it. So it's not necessarily about people taking advantage of the fact that they're white and other people are not. It often goes unnoticed. It just happens, right? And people don't notice. This is not about blaming people, okay? When this conversation of white privilege comes around, a lot of the times you'll hear people who benefit from white privilege say things like, well, what, am I supposed to feel guilty for having white privilege? This is not about guilt, right? There's no blaming individuals because it's a systemic issue. This is not an individual issue. If you are privileged or you, benefit off of one thing because of your race, that's not necessarily because you chose it, right? Like if you are white and you experience white privilege, you didn't choose to experience that, right? You didn't choose to have that privilege, but because we live in a system that prioritizes people who are part of white racial groups, you do benefit from it, right? But I say all this because I want to make sure that this is not an attack on an individual person, right? If you are one of my students and you are white, I don't want you to feel like I'm sitting at my computer saying, or like shaking my finger at you saying, how dare you for being white and having white privilege. No, that's not what it's about. This is not an individual issue. It's a systemic issue. And it's important for us to talk about this because it's important that we understand how systems favor certain groups over others. Because if we don't understand that, how are we going to fix it? And so white privilege is part of that. It's part of the conversation, and we have to understand how it works. So white privilege, it definitely happens like at a bigger, broad scale, but the examples I want to give are kind of more on the smaller scale, I guess. Maybe not all of them, but at least the first one. So accessibility to cosmetics. So think about a time when you were at Sephora or Ulta or even like a drugstore, Target, Rite Aid, whatever, and you're going through the makeup aisle, you pass the makeup aisle. More often than not, like the majority of foundation shades, they're all different shades of white. You know, lighter to darker shades of white, but still white. For a very long time, there was only one shade of makeup for people of color. It was just like dark brown. And if you were a person of color who wanted to wear makeup, you just kind of had to deal with it. You would take that shade of foundation and kind of, you know, fix it up with blushes and bronzers and things like that to try to make the shade, match the color of your skin tone. But think, white people don't have to do that. There's not just one shade of makeup for white people. There are a plethora of shades to fit the different skin tones of white people. That's an example of white privilege. And again, that's not like an individual person's fault, right? Like, it's not about any guilt. Like, if you walk into a makeup store and there's a lot of makeup that works for you, don't feel bad about that. But it's good to notice, wow, there are significantly less makeup brands or shades of makeup that fit people of color, that are made to benefit people of color. So that's an example of white privilege. Hair care products too. If you are looking at shampoo or conditioner, things like that, more often than not, any kind of hair product that's meant for people of color, like curly hair, textured hair, anything like that, one, there are less options for you. There are more shampoos and conditioners or just general hair products that are for, that are not like specific for curly hair, that they just work generally for straight hair. But more often than not, the products for curly hair are locked up. Like, you have to get a lock. You have to get somebody that works there to come unlock it and get that for you. That's called a microaggression, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But white privilege, like, you could, if you are white and you have straight hair like most white people do, or at least not like really curly hair or textured hair like people of color do, you can go and you have lots of options. White privilege. This is a bigger one, job interview callbacks. I know we mentioned it in a previous slide, but if you're white, you're more likely to get called back for a job interview than if you are black. And that's both before the first interview and after a first interview. So for an initial interview, if you have a white sounding name, like whatever that means to you, if you have a white sounding name or an employer reads your application and thinks to themselves, whether consciously or subconsciously, that you have a white sounding name, you are more likely to be called in for an interview than you are if you had a black sounding name, whatever that means to you. Let's say you get past that first job interview. You get called in despite your name. If you are white, if you came in and did the interview and you are white, you are more likely to get called back for a second interview or to get hired than if you are a candidate that is a person of color. So all of these are examples of white privilege. Again, I will emphasize this is not about blaming someone. This is not me trying to make anyone feel guilty if you do benefit from any of these things, but it's important for us to understand so that way we can see these injustices happen, understand the privilege that we have, and use that privilege for good. One of the examples I listed was media representation. I didn't really talk about that. But let's think about celebrities or even just like influencers, right? Like the step below celebrities. Like if you are a white influencer, statistically, you're more likely to have more followers. And that's unfortunate, but it's the truth. That is an example of white privilege. But because you have more eyes on you, you have more followers, you could use that for good, right? You have more followers, more eyes, more people listening to what you have to say. Use that to your advantage to do some good, right? Have things to say to bring light to other issues, to social justice issues, right? Education issues, whatever it may be. Like, white privilege could be used for good, but in order to do that, we have to be aware of what white privilege is, what it looks like, and how, of course, then we can use it for good. So moving on to our next term, it is called othering. Othering is perceiving or portraying someone as fundamentally different or alien, okay? So this doesn't have to do necessarily with just race. You can be othered for different reasons, but because this is our race theory unit, that's kind of what we're focusing on, obviously. It often involves categorizing individuals or groups based on perceived differences such as race, ethnicity, religion, or culture, and treating them as inferior. So seeing somebody else who looks different than you, perceiving them, portraying them as different or alien. This leads to feelings of isolation, marginalization, which reinforces the idea that they don't belong or are somehow less important, okay? When you experience this feeling of being othered, like if somebody makes you feel like you're fundamentally different than them, that does not feel good, right? And if you experience that, that could lead to you separating yourself from the people who are making you feel this way, isolating yourself, which reinforces or helps reinforce this message that society is, continuously trying to embed in us, that if you are not white, you are less important. And so when you're being othered, it helps reinforce that idea. So an example that is relevant to us is if an international student is being left out of decision making in a group project. This happens. I have seen it happen. They feel different. They're made to feel different, like their voice isn't important. And so they're left out of decision making. They don't get to make the same decisions or don't have the same voice in what the group does or what the group makes, simply because of their race, their ethnicity, religion, culture. They are inferior because of these things. This does happen. And as students, we should be aware of it, right? If you have a student in your group who is an international student, they're already learning a new culture, right? So be kind to them. Don't treat them differently because they look different or sound different or are from a different place than you. Welcome them in. Imagine going to a country to go to school where you don't know anybody, where you don't speak the same language, where everything is different. Imagine if you were in that spot. It would be so hard. And then on top of that, your group members are excluding you or making you feel alien because of that. Like, how much harder would that make getting through school? Extremely harder. So as students, be aware of that in your classes. If you see a student where English is not their first language, or they say that they're an international student, be aware of that. Be kind. Go out of your way to make them feel comfortable, because more likely than not, they are feeling fundamentally different because people around them treat them differently. So be aware of what othering is so you can make sure you're not a part of that. We want to be those people who, no matter what, no matter who you are, what you look like, what religion you follow, whatever, we want to be the people to be accepting, okay? And as we've discussed throughout this lecture, sometimes we don't know when we're doing this. We may not be intentionally trying to other somebody, but because we live in a society where so many of our systems, unfortunately, are racist and privilege white people over any other race, like, it happens, and we are part of that. It's like ingrained into us. And so that's why critical race theory is so important. Like, we have to be aware of these things to fix it, to not do it, to be the best versions of ourselves, right? So moving forward, keep an eye out for this. Do not be the student who makes somebody else feel fundamentally different or alien. Okay, so moving on to talking about intersectionality. If you have taken a sociology class, you may have heard this term before. But intersectionality is essentially how different categories intersect each other. Obviously, intersectionality makes sense. But for this class, we're looking at how race intersects with other social categories like gender, class, and sexuality. When these different categories intersect with each other, it creates unique experiences of discrimination or privilege for individuals or groups. So, for example, a Black woman might face discrimination that is different from that faced by a white woman or a Black man due to the combined effects of both racial and gender biases. So, think about this unit, what we've been talking about so far, but also think back to the feminist unit. During that unit, we talked about how men hold the power, right? In the society that we live in, a patriarchy. In a patriarchy, men hold the power. Going back to race, white people hold the power, okay? So if you are a white man, you are in power in both of those categories. If you are a white woman, you still have some power in the white category, but you lose some power because you are a woman. You lose some power in the gender category, right? If you are a Black man, you lose some power because you're Black and not white, but you still have the power of being a man. Whereas a Black woman is discriminated differently because she loses the power in the racial category for being Black, and also loses the power in the gender category for being a woman. So has these two different things that are intersecting, these two different social categories where there are other categories or other parts of these categories that are more privileged than her, right? A Black woman might face discrimination that is different from that faced by a white woman or a Black man due to the combined effects of both racial and gender biases, okay? So race and gender are not the only social categories that we look at for intersectionality. You can see this little visual right here on the slide, and even this is not a comprehensive look at the different categories that can intersect. But outside of gender and race, we have class, nationality, sexual orientation, abilities, as in like if somebody has a disability or not. So all of these different things, we look at how when they intersect, how privilege changes, how discrimination changes, right? And that all depends on where you fall within these social categories, right? That determines how discriminated you are or how privileged you are. All right, so moving on to microaggressions. These are subtle comments or actions that convey prejudiced attitude towards members of marginalized groups. So subtle is the key word here, subtle comments or actions. So these aren't like huge racist actions that you see like, you know, KKK members lynching people or, you know, that kind of thing. These are very subtle things, subtle comments, subtle actions. There are assumptions about people based on stereotypes related to their ethnicity, age, gender, or race that surface or manifest. So obviously here we're focusing on race, so assumptions about people based off of racial stereotypes, essentially. Microaggressions are often committed subconsciously. Like when people are committing microaggressions, they're more often than not aware that they're doing that. However, that is not always the case. So an example of a microaggression that would happen at a subconscious level is saying to someone, wow, you speak English so well, saying that to somebody who isn't white. So that is an example of a microaggression because it's a subtle comment that is conveying prejudice, that because this person isn't white, you would assume that, you know, they don't speak English, that they are different, right? That they are fundamentally alien. That's an example of othering as well, right? You speak English so well. That's also kind of like a subtle attack on intelligence in a way, right? oh, because you're not white, you're not smart enough to learn English. So somebody may not mean it that way, right? Somebody saying, wow, you speak English so well, probably is intended to be a comment, but there's an underlying message here that is prejudice, right, towards a specific group, towards the race that is being said to. A microaggression that is done more on a conscious level, however, is, let's say that there's a Black person walking around a grocery store and the store owner sees this person walking around and becomes suspicious of them. And so rather than, staying at the cashier, wherever they're at, the store owner starts to follow this customer around the store. That is a conscious decision, right? Seeing that they're Black, getting that suspicion, and choosing to follow them to make sure that they're not committing any crime or they're not stealing or, whatever it is. That's a conscious decision. Like, you made the decision to follow somebody around the store, right? Because of these underlying prejudices again. So there are a lot of different examples of microaggressions. I'm going to post on our Canvas page a list of different microaggressions so you can kind of see what those look like. This is a term that I think is particularly important to learn in this, not really just this unit, but just kind of in general, just because it often happens at a subconscious level. So it's important for us to always think about what we're saying and the underlying meaning of what is being said, right? So in this critical thinking class, we've read a lot of literature and we've talked about that literature. And part of critical thinking is figuring out what is being said in the subtext, right? Going past the plot and figuring out, what the author is actually saying. What's the lesson or the message that's being said here? This is kind of like a negative version of that, but it's important for us to figure out, or just to make sure that what we're saying doesn't have any underlying racist, prejudiced messages behind it. All right, our next term is color blindness. You may have heard this term before. So color blindness is the idea that race shouldn't and doesn't affect the way people are treated. It essentially suggests that the best way to end racism, to end discrimination, is to pretend race doesn't exist and ignore the problems that racism causes and has caused throughout history. So earlier on, we talked about social constructionism, about how race is a construct, that somebody invented it, that made it up at some point. A lot of people take that to mean, well, race doesn't exist. Okay, well, yes, race is a construct, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Think about a house. A house is something that somebody created. A house is something that was constructed, but that doesn't mean the house doesn't exist. Right? The house very much so exists. So yes, race is a construct, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So by taking on this idea or ideology of colorblindness, it perpetuates racial inequalities by ignoring the systemic and historical factors that contribute to discrimination that are already built into our systems. So like we've talked about, a lot of the systems that our country operates under, they were built off of racist foundations. And so by pretending that racism doesn't exist or pretending that race doesn't affect people, the way people are treated, that doesn't fix any of the issues that are already built into our system, right? So that doesn't solve anything, which perpetuates these racial inequalities, right? So for example, universities admitting students based solely on merit without taking race into account. So this is a big conversation right now. Last year, I believe it was last year, affirmative action was ended. And what affirmative action is, if you are not aware, it essentially guarantees a certain percentage of students of color being accepted into educational institutions. So now that that's taken away, universities are solely admitting students based off of merit without taking race into account. Straightforward, when you hear that, that might sound fair, but when you think about it, a lot of students of color often lack access to quality education prep sources, tutors, teachers that are more readily available to white students. So like we talked about, discrimination often prevents people of color from having access to these things, right? Limited access to job opportunities and educational opportunities. Quality college prep sources, those cost money, right? Tutors cost a lot of money. If you did any kind of like SAT prep, you know, or at least your parents probably know, that costs a lot of money. Historically, marginalized communities that are made up of mostly non-white individuals or groups, those are normally more impoverished communities because they've been dealt a bad hand in the society that they live in, right? They are living in a government that does not necessarily privilege them, right? And so they don't have access to a lot of these sources because of that. When you live in an impoverished area, you don't have access to all of these other programs that would kind of give you a leg up when getting accepted into a university, right? And so when we talk about accepting students based off of solely merit, again, that sounds fair, like right off the bat, but because our country is built off of these like horrifically racist systems that we want to try to fix, if we just pretend that race doesn't affect the way people are treated, it just perpetuates these racial inequalities and prevents students who probably, there are a lot of students that are extremely smart, right? Just because you're a person of color does not mean you are less intelligent than a white student. Of course, it doesn't mean that. But because you weren't able to access all of these resources, that makes you less privileged than white students who you may be just as smart as, or maybe even smarter. It prevents you from having that leg up that those white students did. So colorblindness, while it may sound like at surface level that we shouldn't think about, race, or that race doesn't affect the way people are treated, colorblindness is dangerous, right? It just continues to perpetuate these racial inequalities. A lot of times, people who are in favor of colorblindness, they will bring up Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington speech, where he says, and I'm going to paraphrase this probably badly, but something in regards to like, I have a dream that one day my children will not be based off of the color of their skin. And so people who believe in colorblindness, they will bring up that speech and say, well, Martin Luther King Jr. didn't want us to, use race like this, but if you read the speech, that's not actually what he's talking about. They're twisting the speech altogether. But yeah, that's kind of an overview of what colorblindness is, this idea that race shouldn't and doesn't affect the way people are treated, and that kind of just continually perpetuates these racial inequalities. Okay, so double consciousness. This is more than likely a term you haven't heard before unless you've done a lot of reading on W.E.B. Du Bois. But double consciousness is a term coined by Du Bois in his piece, The Souls of Black Folk. This is essentially this awareness of belonging to two conflicting cultures, which creates a sense of disconnection from both cultures. So, for example, if you are Mexican and white, sometimes you'll feel that you're too Mexican when you're with your white friends, but you're too white when you're with your Mexican friends. And so it's like, where do you fit in? It creates this sense of disconnection because there is that consciousness of being part of like two different cultures. That's where the double comes in, double consciousness. It's seeing yourself through the eyes of the other, like seeing your Hispanic side through the eyes of being white and seeing being white through the eyes of being Hispanic. And, there is racial tension there. There's discord there. And so by seeing yourself or seeing yourself through the eyes of the other, right? That can cause a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties for people. It results in the splitting of the self. So maybe you act a certain way at home and another way in social settings, which creates this confusion, right? Like, who am I? If you have two different selves, one at home and one in social settings, that often can create this sense of like identity crisis, this sense of disconnection from yourself as a whole. Who am I if I am totally different at home than I am at school? If I'm totally different at home than I am at work or at church? So this idea of double consciousness is this awareness of belonging to two conflicting cultures, seeing yourself through the eyes of the other culture. So that is our overview of critical race theory. To kind of summarize things, here are some questions that you should be asking yourself when you're analyzing literature using this theory. So how are characters of different races portrayed? How are power and authority distributed among characters of different races? What stereotypes are being presented? How does the text address issues of race, racism, inequality, discrimination, or privilege? How do characters' racial identities influence their roles and relationships within the story? And how do race and other social categories like gender, class, sexuality, etc. intersect in the text? The stories that we read don't assume that the intent of the author was to challenge racist ideologies. Part of using this theory is to critique authors who perpetuate racist ideologies, who perpetuate inequalities and discrimination. So keep that in mind during your reading. Don't just assume, okay, this person is, intentionally trying to challenge racist notions. They may not be. Your job or your role reading a certain text may be to point out, okay, hey, this author is perpetuating racial disparity, racial inequalities, discrimination through their work, and explain how they're doing that. So just keep that in mind as you read. We have a lot of really good stories in this unit that I hope you guys enjoy. Like I said earlier in the lecture, I know that this is one of the tougher theories to talk about. With political correctness right now, I think a lot of people just kind of walk on eggshells a little bit because we don't want to say the wrong thing or we don't want to use the wrong terminology to offend somebody. While I completely understand that, and it's good to not want to offend somebody, with this unit, just know that we are all human. We're not here to judge each other, and we're here to learn, right? So if one of us does use the incorrect terminology, that's a good learning opportunity, right? For someone to point out, hey, that's actually not what we should be saying. We should be phrasing it this way or whatever it is, okay? I anticipate that all of us will approach this unit with respect and dignity, just as we have approached each unit so far. This classroom is a safe space, so we are going to treat each other with respect, and we're going to learn a lot this semester and this unit and talk about a lot of good literature. All right, I look forward to analyzing these texts with you. I will see you next time.